Thank you, Michael, for this introduction, and thank you for the plug. I need it. The title is The Cities We Need, and this session is about infrastructure. But basically, we won't be talking about sewers or bridges. We're talking about how we plan our cities, how we define the needs of those cities, how we define the needs of the people who live in those cities. So it would be much softer than the title of the session could lead us to think.
Et je vais vous présenter les participants dans l'ordre alphabétique. Et ensuite, les participants vont parler dans l'ordre alphabétique. Et ensuite, on aura une session de discussion.
First of all, Talia Dorsey is an architect and the founding principal of the Commons, Inc., a strategic design and consultancy firm centered on developing broadly sustainable solutions for complex projects affecting our built and social environment. Her career has taken her all over the world, from the Netherlands to St. Petersburg to Munich to Nigeria. She received her BA from Princeton University and her master's in architecture from MIT. Throughout her career, her work has received numerous awards and has been published and exhibited internationally. She has previously taught at Harvard and MIT and is currently an adjunct professor at McGill University and a visiting professor at l'Université de Montréal. Ilan Gewurz is a real estate developer with expertise in urban planning. As a part of the Pressman Corporation team, he was involved with the design and delivery of Vista 1 and Vista 2, the first LEED Gold residential towers in Quebec. He is currently involved in the master planning and development of Pointe Nord, a LEED ND Gold neighborhood on the riverfront of Nuns Island. Prior to working with Pressman Corporation, Ilan was a consultant with McKinsey & Company, focusing on organizational and cultural transformation. He has designed and taught courses in negotiations and leadership development internationally. Across disciplines, Ilan works to facilitate unique and safe spaces that encourage individuals to thrive and create meaningful communities. Norman Pressman is Professor Emeritus of Planning and Urban Design at the School of Urban and Regional Planning of the University of Waterloo and founding president of the Winter Cities Association. Internationally known, he has published widely in the field concerned with urban design and winter cities research, and lectures on subjects of public policy, design, and development planning with emphasis upon cold climate regions. Some of you may have seen him featured in Montreal Gazette columnist Josh Fried documentary Life Below Zero that was done 3 years ago. Vaughan was elected to the House of Commons as Member of Parliament for the Toronto riding of Trinity-Spadina on June 30th last year. He is a liberal critic for housing and urban affairs. Before his election, Vaughan was already well known to Torontonians, serving 2 terms as a city councillor. And before that, for 2 decades, he was an activist and a municipal affairs journalist. He led campaigns to rebuild and revitalize existing public housing stock and initiated policies to create family housing, supportive housing, and new co-op housing programs in Toronto.
Chacun des participants va, là je lis ce qu'on m'a dit, va parler entre 6 et 8 minutes.
Vous savez tous ce que ça veut dire entre 8 et 10 minutes. Je vais néanmoins être très strict, c'est moi qui est le gardien du temps, pour nous laisser le temps nécessaire pour le débat. Et après les présentations, nous aurons une période de discussion entre panélistes et ensuite on élargira le débat à l'ensemble de la table. Et donc la première personne à parler, c'est Talia Dorsey.
Morning, bon matin. First of all, a little caveat, you're going to have to forgive me on a couple of fronts. I have fighting a brutal cold, and I do have a little fella in here that likes to press on my diaphragm, so forgive some breathlessness on both counts. So I wanted to talk to you today about a project that I think relates in a very interesting way to the panel discussion today, and is also a big initiative that we've undertaken through the Commons Inc. with the support of a lot of partners and interested parties. And what it is, it's called the Civic Assets Project. And the Civic Assets Project was something that was born out of a sort of walk around town, whereupon I started to notice this kind of phenomenon. And it wasn't the graffiti. It was actually the for sale signs. And this is a post office in St. Henry. And what sort of started to get to me a bit was, I just started to think about post offices, and I started to think about what post offices were. And when you think about it, what post offices actually are, yes, they're sort of generally nice high architectural value buildings, but they're buildings that are located in totally strategic positions, totally distributed within the urban fabric, with a distribution network that's highly efficient and designed behind it in every city across the country. And when you think about it as an asset, beyond just a piece of a building, when you start to think about it like that, it starts to become something a little less trivial than simply another building that should be put up for sale to the free market. And so what I found shocking was that there just hadn't been, one, sort of a public discourse, and two, that this was even being sort of thought of as a sort of, a relatively, facile solution to, immediate financial pressures. And I had the privilege of sort of voicing this rant and amongst the sort of crew of people that were pretty high level. This is not my presentation. Sorry. Well, sorry. Okay, something is there. Okay, I'm missing some slides, but that's okay. Anyhow, but the idea was essentially that, this wasn't a problem limited to post offices, but actually was a larger issue that was endemic, to other civic assets such as schools, churches, libraries, but equally sort of social clubs, delis, which are essentially what we dub then the civic assets. And what these things are those entities that have contributed to, participated to, and helped build the civic fabric of our cities. And so we started to realize that this was happening sort of across the board. As you can see, this is sort of, what happens every other day as you start to see these newspaper articles. And so we devised the Civic Assets Project. And the idea essentially was to rethink the ways in which we start to repurpose and conceive of these assets. And first of all, create a recognition system so that we understand them as such. And the reason that we felt this was imperative is that we felt that these were really critical to the health of our cities, and they bore an inherently strategic relationship to our urban fabric. So rather than just selling them off to the free market, it was actually about repurposing them in a way that may maintain their civic function. So not just simply preservation on the terms of bricks and mortar, but actually preservation in terms of civic function. And understanding that these things are inherently and collectively a civic infrastructure of our cities that needs to be understood as such. To give you an example, this was sort of an analysis that we did for a project that in the office, and we were interested in looking at some of the independent cultural institutions in the city. And what you see are the location of these things. Just to give you an idea, for the non-Montrealers, maybe Mount Royal is sort of the dark spot in the middle there. So you can see this sort of, a lot happens on the east, the plateau, not surprising, downtown. The yellow are the older institutions, the red are the newer institutions, and though these seem to be sort of, there's obviously a sort of concentration pattern that emerges, there's not much more sort of logic necessarily until you start to look, for instance, at the pattern of, this is the orange line of the metro. So what we realized was actually that there was sort of very coherent logic that was emerging for sort of the founding of these independent cultural institutions that was more or less following what we called the sort of orange axis of cultural growth, moving from sort of the east end through to the west. This sort of even, I think, further at this point would be evident. So the idea is that there's sort of these hidden logics behind these assets, right? There's actually sort of a great degree of intelligence embedded in the physical matter of these assets, and it's about leveraging that intelligence towards sort of perpetuating the health through new and contemporary civic functions. I just want to underscore it's not about, sort of a nostalgic sense of preservation. It's not saying, we must at all costs save the postal service. We're very understanding of the realities of contemporary evolution in our cities, but the point is that there must be sort of new civic functions that can be strategically matched to those assets that might allow for both sort of the legacy of those assets to be perpetuated as much as the new civic functions to be supported through the intelligence latent in that asset. So what we've done is actually started to sort of set up a means by which to start to classify and understand the strategic potential of these assets, which are the sort of icons that you see here. And so we want to sort of associate and also just showing you a bit the range that we're talking about. Civic assets are not just the schools, libraries, and such, but here you see the velodrome, for instance, which is one of the buildings on the Olympic site. This is the Metro News Agency on the left, which is now defunct, but was actually the first 800 square foot little shop in downtown Montreal that carried international newspapers. And so it became the de facto hub for sort of those interested in international news sort of as soon as it could be accessed. It closed about 10 years ago, but remains a sort of very, I think, potent location within the downtown core. So here, just very quickly, I won't go into it too much, but just so you start to understand sort of the way that we're starting to think about it. It's one, yes, typological classification, but also looking at sort of the reasons and the mechanisms of obsolescence, understanding sort of the footprint of impact of these different assets, and looking at their inherent relationship to the urban fabric. All of this is to sort of generate a map of understanding of how these things might function, not only unto themselves, but also collectively, right? There's a reason that the sort of school is located in proximity to the church, in proximity to the library, in proximity to that social club and such. And so what we're really trying to do is look a lot more infrastructurally at these things and looking at it on a portfolio basis for a number of reasons. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, here's an example in China, for instance, where it's quite literally the infrastructure that's being adapted. These are phone booths that have obviously become defunct for a lot of reasons. Here they've been converted into Wi-Fi hotspots. This was a winning proposal for a CCA charrette for students where it was about the subject of the charrette was to look at the relationship between university and city and to see whether there were new models that might be appropriate. They proposed that all the defunct churches be acquired by Université de Montréal and become a distributed education network within the city and literally deploy some of the architectural elements and strategic potential of church through, as you can see, in relationship to Université de Montréal. This is another project that we did for the Empress Theatre, which was, sounds serious, Alain. Oh, it's good. So we proposed, this was a former theater that has a sort of long and storied history that we proposed in contemporary terms to become an analog institute. 2 minutes. Got it. So the point is that, sort of if we stop looking at these things as just simply a collection of different buildings and start to understand them as an infrastructure that has a very kind of interconnected relationship, then we'd understand that we can't just simply sell them off and decommission different aspects of it in the way that we would never think of looking at our water infrastructure and saying, let's just sell off that main, and we'll sell off that main, and we'll sell off that main without realizing that that's going to have a serious impact on the efficiency and function of essential infrastructures in our city. And where it becomes really interesting to us on an infrastructural level is to say, when we start to look at this is a sort of study of the metabolic flows of our city. And this is where it starts to sort of think where, it's one thing to understand things as civic infrastructure now. What we're interested in is also to say, what does a civic infrastructure look like 20 years from now? And to me, I think there's a real sort of clue within these types of diagrams. This essentially is looking at the water flow in a city. So in the same way, we can start to sort of understand that this is the physical infrastructure that supports this. Here's another one that looks at sort of the food flows in Vancouver. Then we can start to say, well, how does that relate to this? And how does that relate to this? And once we start to bring it to this level, then we can start to ask ourselves, is there ways that by which the civic infrastructure and, for instance, civic assets, as in very much in a way, the sort of, we talked about the hard infrastructure versus the soft infrastructure. How can the hard infrastructure that are the civic assets start to become sort of a means by which to understand in a much more sophisticated way the behavior and social patterns of our cities today? So, the argument in a way is to understand that when you have a site like this, there's an inherent logic that might allow for a total new repurposing structure. That was a market in Vancouver. This is the Plaza of Nations, which was built for Expo 86 and became a sort of real hub and locus of activity for the city and the international community in the same way that that market had once upon a time. But before we start to sort of repurpose, sort of willy-nilly according to the demands of the day, or we sort of take drastic action to sort of demolish, I think we need to start thinking seriously about the true potential that the civic assets represent in terms of civic infrastructures of today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Talia. And now, Ilan, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm going to move us from the macro to a bit more the micro. I'm going to share some perspectives from a development process that we're working on, a mixed-use project on the northern tip of Nuns Island here in Montreal. Just to give you a word on where I'm coming from, I had a previous career as a lawyer working in mediation and conflict resolution and an organizational consultant transforming cultures and organizations and adult education before coming to urban planning. And for me, really in all of those spaces, the goal was to create meaningful spaces. How do you create spaces where individuals can flourish and can thrive and can be their authentic selves? And that is what we were bringing to the urban plan as we approached this site. It wasn't an obvious site between two bridges and isolated. And we asked ourselves, looking at this site, how do we create a fabulous place? What is the soft and hard infrastructure needed? Why will someone want to live and spend time on this site? And so I wanted just to share with you some of the values that drove the master planning process, whether we were looking at creating the public space or the parks or the buildings themselves. We asked ourselves in every decision that we took throughout the process, which was many years, does this create a sense of aliveness? Is this space going to have energy and a sense of aliveness, in the words of Christopher Alexander? Will the individual feel secure and safe to be their authentic selves in this space? And does the space foster community? Are we creating a space that will facilitate people meeting their neighbors and interacting with each other rather than living in silos? And they may not seem like very sophisticated underlying principles, but if you think, if this is forthright, if this is front and center in every decision for a developer, it can create a very interesting process in the development process. And I just want to show you how it played itself out in the master planning of the Point North. We wanted to create great public spaces. And so I can show you literally 100 versions of this plaza. It's the center of our community, the plaza. How do you create it big enough so it becomes a gathering place and a public space, but small enough so that if you're there alone with a cup of coffee and a magazine, you don't feel lost, but you feel like there's a sense of place. And this plaza is now in place, and it is a gathering place for the community, linked to the park and linked to the water. But it's not enough to create public spaces. We had to animate public spaces. Eventually, this animation will happen from the bottom up. It will happen from the residents and from the community that takes root in the neighborhood, and that's already happening. But we wanted to lay the groundwork for that, the soft infrastructure. And so we worked with the city to create a concert series on Wednesday nights throughout the summer. You're all invited. It's free and it's public. And it really has, we've seen, started to create community where people come out with their lawn chairs and they meet their neighbors, where it's just not so obvious today in the way our communities are functioning to really create a sense of community and a local identity. And as you'll hear from Norman Pressman soon, we are a winter city, and so we have to adapt to winter realities. And so this park doubles as a ice skating rink in the winter, free and on the river, but also we had to create the infrastructure to enable that to happen. It's the city who makes the ice skating rink, but we had to prepare the infrastructure for that to be possible. We know, William White wrote a great book about the social importance of small urban spaces, one of the fathers of placemaking, and we knew that it wasn't just about creating one big plaza, but that our neighborhood had to have many meaningful small spaces, public spaces, to have layers of meaning where you can find nooks and crannies throughout the neighborhood. And that's complex, but we tried to create throughout the neighborhood places to sit and look at the river or take your bike or hang out with your family to create that texture and that quality throughout the neighborhood. We also felt that the public spaces had to link us to our history and to our heritage. So you'll see the stone throughout the neighborhood. A lot of people don't know, but although it is written on plaques and throughout the neighborhood, but this is un rappel historique. It's a historical a reflection of the Nuns' Manor, the stone that was used in the Nuns' Manor that was actually once on this site or on Nuns' Island. And so the importance of making sure that our public spaces linked the past and the present. I'm talking fast to make sure I'm within my 8 to 10 minutes. We also wanted to make sure that we designed in order to create community. Now, the neighborhood of old had a main street, which was the heart of the neighborhood, where people walked and met their grocer and met their neighbor, and it felt good just to walk down that street. Real classic main street. And so we located the main street of this neighborhood in the heart of the community so that it could function as the heart of the community. And it's not always easy because architects have their own agenda, but to make sure that our architects change the architecture on the first 20 feet, that the architecture of the first 20 feet read as a human scale with warm materials to create that sense of neighborliness and neighborhoodiness. And so we put in wood and stone on those first 20 feet to create that commercial Main Street feel. But also the choice of commerce was not obvious. We said no to higher rents with national franchises because we felt that the principle of commercial should be mom and pop stores, where people go into the store and know the owner and feel at home at the bakery, feel at home in the coffee shop. That's something that we've lost over time, and we wanted to make sure that the main street was a mom and pop main street of our neighborhood. And so our restaurant is a community restaurant with a big terrace where people literally go multiple times a week and hang out and meet their neighbors and hang out with friends. But to create community, you also need to bring people out onto the street. And so we designed for walkability and bikeability. That means literally measuring the length of blocks to make sure they're comfortable for walking, and analyze the width of sidewalks or the distance between buildings on streets. How do we create sidewalks where it's fun to walk down, where they're big enough to have space but not so big that you're lost, where the trees are not new and they'll be big in 20 years, but where they give a sense of place from day one, and where the bicycle network really covers the whole community. The placement of townhouses was very important for us because we didn't want to create Manhattan. We didn't want towers coming down to the ground floor. We wanted to create a human scale because it's nice to walk next to a 2 or 3 story building that have stoops that create that walkability and that neighborhood sense. And so the third factor was building upon the organic qualities of the site. Every location is different, and you really have to analyze what is special about this site in order to bring that up in your master plan. Our site, even though it had its challenges, was right on the river and has great views of downtown Montreal. And so the entire master plan was designed in order to leave very big openings towards the downtown. It's the view of the downtown that gives people an energy, a sense of aliveness. And so we wanted to offer that to people, but not just from the condos above, but from the ground floor. We oriented the streets to look at the views in order to democratize that view. We also left big openings and access to the river. You know, Montreal is an island, and we don't have fabulous waterfront experiences where you can go and touch the river. And we wanted to change that. And so in this neighborhood, the river really is ever present, and it's there in the ebbs and flows. It's in every moment of people's patterns of their lives. I'm going to go back. Skipping that slide. I lost a slide there for you. We wanted to create fabulous green spaces, if I can get it to hold on that slide, which reflected the organic qualities of the site. So we placed the waterfront park not in the middle of the neighborhood, but right on the river to celebrate the river. And like the public spaces, the park had to be not just a big place, but a sense of connectivity. So it's a linear waterfront park that connects the community and also the community to other parts and other communities. So you can walk on the main street in a wooded area or right on the river, all at your doorstep. Sustainability, we're the only LEED Gold neighborhood towers with geothermal energy, but it's also a LEED Gold neighborhood plan, which means that environmental values and also proximity is taken into account, lifestyle in every aspect of design and planning. I'll just give you two examples of the hundreds. We really worked hard to improve the public transport on the site, improve the buses and bring in Communoto and Bixi. We were overjoyed when they announced that the light rail is going to have a stop right in this neighborhood. Another example is water recuperation. We have green roofs and a whole system of rainwater capture, which serves as green roofs, which are both energy efficient and nice to look on for the residents. And finally, the last point is innovation of architecture and design. We worked with 3 architects in order to ensure that there was an integration of architecture, but also a diversity of architecture. We wanted the neighborhood to feel like an organic place and not like the projects. We wanted to ensure diversity of housing typology. To create community, you have to have diversity, and so we have units that are small and big for families, for different cycles in the life cycle, at different price points, because that was very important for the creation of community. And finally, we had to create fabulous living spaces, because that's what we were selling. And so I just want to flag in my last minute a couple of key challenges that we faced and that we can discuss in the question period. For master planning, I think the public-private partnership is always a challenge. How do you get the city to come into step with the civic functions and also to buy into a long-term vision and work with the city on a long-term vision? How do you time commercial? We wanted to have fabulous commercial there before there were people living there to support it. And so how do you time the commercial to ensure that even your first residents have great coffee shops and places to go? Phasing is very important. We wanted to make sure that our first residents didn't feel like they were living in a construction site for 10 years. And so the movement of earth and the phasing was really thought out. Parking is critical. How do you create enough parking that creates ease of access and comfort without becoming a suburb or a shopping mall? And finally, pressure from shareholders. Every one of these decisions has an economic impact. And how do you convince shareholders sometimes to have the long-term view, to say, it's good to take a mom-and-pop restaurant which will pay you less rent and is more risky than the national retailer because it will create more fabric in this neighborhood, which in the long term will pay off for you and for the neighborhood. So it's about educating people to creating meaningful spaces and creating the soft infrastructure that's needed to create fabulous communities. If you want to learn more about it, that's where you find us, and thank you for your time.
Merci beaucoup, Alain. Maintenant, Norman Pressman.
It's a pleasure to be back at McGill, where I studied a few years ago. And I'd like to thank the people who organized this conference for inviting me to speak to you. I want to talk about something that's quite controversial, the whole question of winter. People love it and people hate it. Most of the studies have shown that as we age, we hate it more. People in middle age are sort of have mixed sentiments about it. But what I really want to talk about is cities in winter and how we can have better cities in winter. Most of our sources of inspiration have come from the South, US of A, in terms of urban design and urban planning concepts. Also from Central Europe, founding cultures, Britain, France, and surrounding areas. They don't have severe winters at all. We have to look north for any inspiration, and we have to be very innovative. Just to show you where we are, there's a winter severity index For selected winter cities, Montreal is at 49. This is on a 0 to 100 scale. 100 is a very severe winter. Anything less than about 40 is exceptionally mild. You know when you live in a winter city. I don't have to tell Montrealers that they're living in a winter city. You know it when you feel it. There are very few cities outside of Canada that are significantly colder with significant populations than we have here. So Montreal at 49 is only beaten on the severity index by cities in northern Russia and in Siberia. Cities like Irkutsk at 59, cities like Novosibirsk at 59, and a few other cities like Quebec City at 54, Saskatoon at 55, Winnipeg at 56, and all the rest of the cities basically are much milder. The Scandinavian cities, except for northern Finland, are quite mild. Copenhagen at 25, it's nothing. It's not a winter city. Stockholm at 38, it's also not much of a winter city. Iceland, which conjures up images of ice and snow, but if you look at Reykjavik, it's only at 38. So there are very few places in the world outside of Canada that are actually colder, and if you factor in the urban populations in Canada, we are the coldest urban country in the world. What do we do about it? Well, there are a few things that we actually can do about it. If we look at the average number of comfortable outdoor days where you can be outside, sitting in a cafe, on a patio, sitting in a park, just walking, lounging around. A comfortable outdoor day is one that is 9 degrees Celsius or warmer in the spring, or 11 degrees Celsius or warmer in the fall. A lot of research has been done on this, and mostly in Scandinavia, and they find that when the temperature in the fall falls below 11 degrees Celsius, people won't go outside anymore. They won't hang out there in open space and public space. They won't sit in parks. They'll withdraw inside. In the spring, they'll come out at 9 degrees. And the reason for that is very simple. After spending a very cold winter, 9 degrees feels like 11 degrees because your body physiologically has changed and has accommodated to the cold. And because of cabin fever, people spend a lot of time indoors. They have this urge to go out, so they'll accept 2 degrees less. So that's what we talk about outdoor comfort days. A city like Edmonton has 135 outdoor comfortable days. That's only about a third of the year, a little more than a third of the year. Montreal has about 150 comfortable outdoor days. That's less than half a year. Toronto has 175 comfortable outdoor days. It's exactly half a year. So half of the year, people are spending inside. That's a very, very significant number. But there's something we can change. And here, Oslo has 133 outdoor comfort days. There are 2 variables that we can manipulate, sun and wind. And these have a very big impact on the microclimate in the city, in urban space. If you take a look, these are on the left, number of comfortable outdoor days, and park usability. If you can remove the wind, you can see that in January and February, people can go out for about 6.5 outdoor days. If there's no wind, if there's wind, you'll never go out. But in March and April, in the marginal seasons of spring, you can see how many extra outdoor days you can add just by removing wind. So March and April, that's quite a lot. And then the same thing in the fall. in September and October, if you can remove windiness, let's say you're on the waterfront here in Montreal, let's say you're on Ilan site on Nuns Island, must be very windy there from time to time. If you can remove the wind, you can increase the number of comfortable outdoor days by 6 weeks. 3 weeks more in the fall and 3 weeks more in the spring. That's about 45 to 50 days. It's 30% of the number of comfortable outdoor days you can increase. That's a very, very significant number just by removing wind. And I mean, you know all about the discomfort elements of winter. You can experience it. Just take a walk on Sherbrooke Street or anywhere now. It's slushy and icy and windy and falling icicles and slush and spray, and I don't have to tell you about that because you live it. The other variable that you can play with is sunlight. If you have tall buildings, they create wind and especially turbulence at the base, and they also create tremendous shadows. That combination of shadow or lack of sunlight and wind is absolutely devastating. You can make all kinds of calculations of sunlight angles so that you can have at least a sunny side of a street to walk on, for example. And I think that's very important. So you want to maximize exposure to the sun, minimize exposure to the wind. The other thing is snow and snowdrift. You can make all kinds of models and simulations and put them in wind tunnels and water flumes, and microclimatic engineers know how to do that, and they can predict very accurately where the largest snowdrifts will occur and where the windy spots and wind turbulence and wind tunnels will occur. You want to make that as comfortable as you can. We don't generally do most of this in Canadian cities, and it's not difficult to do. We can learn from human behavior. When you get wind, people generally will put their hood on from their jacket and parka, and they'll crouch, as you see in the upper slide here, and create a kind of aerodynamic situation where you're protected from the wind. In nature, trees do exactly the same thing. And you can create aerodynamic buildings at the bottom where wind can be funneled around and over a building very easily. You can control wind velocity and you can control wind direction by just using planting. This is just an example from the University of Alberta campus. Planting buffers in a heavily used corridor, or by using wind screens or walls to deflect the angle of the wind. There are many techniques for that. If you want to do little small vest pocket parks, you have to make sure they're wind protected in the upper section and their southern exposure. South facing, you want to create outdoor rooms, you have to have coniferous vegetation protecting you on the windward side, creating a lee effect which is comfortable, and having a lot of sun pockets and southern exposure. You can do that for neighborhoods as well. If you're planning a neighborhood or a new subdivision, if you can do an aerodynamic building, you can do an entire urban envelope adopting that principle, deflecting winds over a town or over a micro neighborhood, creating improved conditions in the network of streets and public spaces. The same thing for public furniture. This is an example of some public furniture in San Francisco, which is not a winter city, but it's a very good example for a winter city. Creating a wall or a barrier to the wind and facing south, and if you have a nice view, in addition to the southern exposure, you're really in good shape. The same thing for bus shelters. I mean, until about 10 or 15 years ago, most Canadian cities never had bus shelters, but we need very, very good bus shelters, and we need them heated, and we need to heat the sidewalks, and we need to heat ramps, and we need to heat stairs that are intensively used by people, and we need more glassed over protection. So wind and snow are rulers of the winter landscapes in the north, in the harsh climate of northern latitudes. Wind, frost, and snow together, and variations in sun angles and daylight over the seasons are very important factors for planning and design. We don't need too much research on this. We have it all. We know all the techniques. We know all the urban planning and architectural tricks to make much better livable winter cities, but we're not applying them. And most of the regulatory machinery and apparatus in approval in cities projects do not demand or obligate planners, architects, designers, developers to do these kinds of things. Until they're done, our cities won't be very livable, and we'll just hibernate. Thank you very much. And
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, Adam Vaughan.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour l'invitation, pour la conférence aujourd'hui. That is the French I'm practicing as I am now a backbencher in Ottawa, and I have to do an extraordinary amount of maintenance on my French as I get it up to speed. So I apologize for my presentation in English today in its entirety. A couple of things. I find it interesting that the logo is a series of buildings, almost every single one of them built with public dollars. It is interesting the way we look at our cities and how we recognize our cities as public realities. If we were to rely on the private sector in its entirety, the landscape would be the shadow in the background. And I think that's fascinating. But it also is interesting that not one of those buildings houses people. And the reason we build cities is to live in them, not just to visit and play. And I think that it's important to start thinking about cities a little bit differently if we're going to start building better cities and different cities as a result. The three panelists that spoke before me are experts in delivering components of cities to our lives. And what I found interesting about them, if you compress their presentations, the first one talked about repurposing public assets, repurposing public investments to continue to deliver opportunities to people. The second person was speaking from a private sector perspective, but was trying to leverage private sector activity and economic strength to deliver public amenity. And the ratio of private to public is something to take a look at in that presentation. And then the final presentation around climate stress, which is driving the urban agenda in so many ways beyond just comfort levels. Climate change and storms of the century, which are happening almost annually now in most major cities across this country, is defining how we live in cities, whether or not cities will survive the next century, and whether or not the infrastructure we're building for cities is in fact appropriate. And the way in which we deal with these extreme conditions will define whether or not Canada survives the next century. We are the most urbanized country in the G7, one of the most urbanized countries in the world, and yet that extreme, which where close to 90% of us are living in cities, is also being done in a country where climate and space is more extreme than in any other G7 countries. So if you're a transit operator in the United States, you have smaller spaces to travel, but you also have more programs to pay for less transit. If you are in a country like Australia, where you have massive amounts of geography, but you have climate on side, the fortification construction of your infrastructure is radically different, and yet you've got national programs in transit, in policing, in housing, which simply don't exist in this country. Canada is at a turning point with its cities, and if we don't start to figure out how to reinvest in our infrastructure, the quality of life we currently enjoy will rapidly evaporate. I speak to this as a member of I used to joke when I was at City Council and Rob Ford was our mayor that I needed a witness protection plan. I chose to go to the back benches of opposition. But I think the more appropriate joke perhaps for this is not having a PowerPoint, because while I speak of this, I have neither power nor a point to make as I sit in opposition. We have got to change some things up in Ottawa if what I talk about today is going to become a reality in this country. We have got to get back to building cities as a country. And that involves some significant rethinking of what we term as infrastructure and how we lead that conversation. Because none of the ideas that you saw realized here or presented here today will be realized if cities don't have the capacity to experiment again. And as they currently move through their budget cycles, and I did this for a couple of terms at City Council, as they move through their budget cycles, they just don't have that capacity to experiment. Their water systems, Montreal's water system, leaks at about 35% of the water that comes out of the river, never makes it to your tap, and if it does make it to your tap, it doesn't get back to the river clean. That's an extraordinary inefficiency. It requires an amazing amount of energy to realize if you don't fix that water system, you're going to have very expensive electricity bills very shortly, because the water system is the largest consumer of electricity within any city. If you take a look at the challenges we have around gridlock and the absolute inability to move people to work, let alone move goods and services across the urban fabric, if we don't change that, not only will we generate enormous amounts of greenhouse gas in gridlock and again an inefficient use of scarce energy, we also make living in the city that much more difficult. And one of the byproducts is that affluence moves closer and closer to work, closer and closer to the point where affluence is generated, and poverty starts moving further and further away, and all of a sudden the people who need public transit the most have the least amount of transit available to them with the biggest distance to travel. It is not a sustainable model, and if you want to know what the outcome of that looks like, you can go to any European city where most of the social unrest is not rooted into the downtown cores, but is in the post-war suburbs that have been abandoned by middle-class communities and affluence. And so we have got to start to think about how we build our cities differently, and we have got to think about changing some very basic mathematics in this country. There is about a $660 billion infrastructure deficit in Canada. We have spent the last 25 years doing everything but building a country. We have built budgets, and we have not built cities. And as a result of that, that infrastructure deficit has been downloaded and now resides at the municipal level. Close to 60% of that $660 billion is controlled and managed by cities in this country, and not big cities. Most of it's done by little tiny cities. Their tax base is 8% of the tax base of this country. You cannot sustain urban infrastructure with 8% of the tax base when you're trying to manage 60% of the investment. It is a recipe for failure. But that's where we stand right now. And we have a constitution and we have a government, because I was a journalist before I was a member of parliament, before I was a city councillor. I remember asking Stephen Harper about his housing policy, about his urban strategy, and I was told, quite frankly, by a fundamentalist, that if you looked in the Constitution, you would not find the cities and the federal government mentioned in the same breath, and that I should read the Constitution to understand where my question should be asked, which is at City Hall, not in Ottawa. And it's just a fundamental misread of history, almost a deliberate misread of history. The truth is that Canada has always built cities. In fact, we built this country by building cities, and it was almost always done with a housing program, which was disguised as a land grant. When you got, a couple of acres or a square mile of property out west, you got a piece of property with all the trees and bricks and water and mud and clay that you needed to build a house and start a business. But the federal government now says it never had that responsibility and should never have had that responsibility. And in fact, we're going to be governed by a piece of paper which was written before electricity was invented. It's got to change. And the way to change it is fundamentally very simple. First of all, you've got to transfer dollars to the cities so they have the capacity to experiment again. So these ideas aren't fine-grained, but in fact are broad, and we can afford failure, because not all these ideas will work first time out. The second thing we need to do is we need to reinvest and recreate a housing strategy. The private development that we're showing has a range of sizes, and I would guess a narrow range, because it's a private sector project, of affordability. We have got to start to celebrate something which has now become a defining characteristic of multiculturalism, which is racialized poverty. We have got to start to speak about economic diversity in our urban form. And that requires a housing strategy to get people of different economic means living close to where work is, so that we take the stress off of infrastructure and deliver real cities to real people in the way in which they live. This is the work that was made apparent to me and made clear to me as a journalist when I saw journalism disappearing as a profession in the city. Apologies, but you could see journalism and the capacity to think in journalism disappearing as we got smaller and smaller platforms to speak from. I moved into City Council, and when I arrived at City Council and started some of the experiments, which we'll probably talk about on the stage later, the one thing that became very clear was that without a new Deal for cities, or a revisit of the New Deal to cities in some ways, without a reinvestment in cities, and with a different political approach to how we build this country, cities are going to fail. And when cities in this country fail, they take 90% of us with it. And that's not acceptable. And so thank you for the invitation to talk today. I look forward to the panel discussion. And merci pour l'invitation.
Does it work? Yes. I cheated. I was supposed to be very strict, and I wasn't. Because I think I was interested by the presentation. I thought that it would not have been a good idea to cut our speakers. We didn't talk about steel and concrete. But we talk, but there's a link between those very different presentations. They all talk about human beings, about sense, about livability, and so there's a common ground between all those presentations that can help our discussion. We'll start to discuss among ourselves, and then we'll go to if you have questions or commentaries, it will be your turn. I have a first question because. Except Adam, nobody talked about it, but it's always present, and it was the object of talks yesterday. It's money. Everything you were talking about needs money. And so do we have a problem in Canada about financing urban development? I know the answer, but I want to hear how strongly we'll say it.
Sure. I mean, yesterday's panelist of mayors talked about how, this is not me quoting, but the mayor said, the federal have the money, the provincial have the jurisdiction, and the city has the problem. And I think that there's a truth to that. We are certainly interfacing with a municipal government, and we are always in discussions and in negotiations over bylaws and zoning, and yet we're very aware that the tax base that we're creating, which is very significant, is not going to them. It's going to the larger city, the larger city and then the province. And so I think that there's a problem of alignment of incentives. I'm not close enough, as Adam can speak to this better in terms of whether the money is there, but I certainly feel that in discussions with cities, you don't feel that the budget is in place to be able to support these projects.
You can't run cities off of Victorian concepts. Property tax does not support major cities. In fact, if you look at most cities over a population of about $650,000, you'll find they have taxes that grow with the economy, so that their budget is scaled to their success. And until we change the relationship between cities and the province, and between the federal government and the provinces, and I realize saying that in Quebec may be a very thorny issue to raise, but until we change that relationship, we're going to struggle. We are not a country of farms anymore, and the colonialism that gave birth to our municipal environment, and also gave birth to our federal government, has got to be rethought, and with that comes a rethinking of how the money is shared. You're not going to like, my party won't like me saying this, but we have also got to figure out how to celebrate what we accomplish with taxes. As I said, every picture of every city, every skyline is defined by a public project. And charity didn't build the CN Tower any more so than the Olympic Games, which may have been a huge charity, was delivered by some sort of private initiative. And so changing the game on that is critically important, and it's tough to do. It's not easy to do, but as I said, 90% of us live in cities, and if Canadian cities fail, we fail.
I think too that what's interesting is I think we're at a moment where, in a way, there's sort of we keep talking about the third way in a bit, and even in the Civic Assets Project, we actually kind of deliberately stay away from sort of exclusively determining these things in terms of publicness or privateness. There is sort of an intermediary space that has to do with civicness. for us. But I think that's equally reflected in some of the mechanisms that are being developed, and Quebec's an interesting example just because of, I think, the legacy and length and maturity of the social economy that exists here, which, to me, in a way, exists within that sort of third space between, sort of public and private, but what you see emerging, I think, and, it's a bit, what Adam was saying too in terms of, I think it connects to maybe a bigger discussion, which is the notion of experimentation. I think that, I was at a big event that was about labs for social change, which is a little bit of an emergent field, not a totally new concept, but I think dubbed as such and as a movement as such is relatively new. And they said, what we don't allow is we don't allow our governments to fail. It's just not allowed. And and it was in the context of trying to understand why is it that this sort of notion of these labs for social change are emerging. And in a way, that's exactly what governments should be doing, is they should have their own labs for social change, which exist in places like, in Finland, there's the Helsinki Design Lab, which was actually a branch of the Finnish government designed to sort of test and bump up against what they call the sort of dark, and explore the dark matter of bureaucracy. So sort of through very real pilot projects, start to understand where the bureaucracy is failing in terms of sort of ground-up initiatives, meeting sort of governmental agendas on a more macro scale. Now, that's a very enlightened model, that I think many governments haven't sort of caught on to yet. And as a result, there's sort of these emergent things that are happening. So even the Civic Assets Project, to a certain extent, I think should be a governmental initiative, but in a way, the bureaucracies are large, the ships are big and hard to steer. And in a way, we're kind of, I think, and I don't mean us specifically, but collectively, I think there's sort of a new space being generated to allow for experimentation that is sort of not acceptable and exclusively in the private sector, in the sense that, private sector has its own sort of mandates, but I think, we're merging. I think, Alain's presentation shows the ways in which even private projects are starting to converge with public interests. And I think that's a very interesting space that ultimately will likely, I think in most cases, be absorbed on one side or the other. All to say that I think also on a financial level, experimentation is actually a hugely creative domain. I think often people think of finance as sort of this very nut and bolt operation. But I think it's actually kind of it's an incredible space for innovation that we see in a lot of different ways. So for instance, there's community trusts that are happening, there's a whole slew of different financial tools and models that are being developed, I think, to speak to the lack of nuance that exists currently in the financial landscape.
Can I just add one thing on that last point, and to Adam's point? It's easy to hang this all just on money, and I think that, to Adam's point about the role of government, I think it takes a cultural shift of cities or governments being much more proactive. I think that especially with private developments, their money is there, and it can be found if it's structured in the right way. And so we find that a lot of cities are reactive to developers who are making requests for permits or building, and the cities are following and trying to put the pieces in place to make sure nothing goes too wrong. But the cities could be a lot more proactive, but it takes dialogue with local developers. And in our case, we're only one developer, but in most situations, there are a multitude of interests that need to come around the table to talk about how do you find the money in order to put that infrastructure in place. So the money doesn't always have to come from the city, but I think that the proactive vision really should.
Norman, what do you think?
Well, just a very brief comment on the subject area that I spoke about. This, in terms of making the climate more acceptable or more livable, this falls exclusively under municipal jurisdiction, under building project approvals, those kinds of mechanisms. But I think you can get a big impact for a very small cost, because in many cases it's just the question of planting a few trees in the right space, in the right position. And in other cases it might be just changing the shape of a building, or changing the orientation of a building, or dealing with the details at the ground level of a high-rise tower so that wind turbulence is deflected away from a plaza, which is used by pedestrians by and large. So we're talking about not big bucks at all, just about doing something a little differently with probably a net zero expense to it.
And the challenge is that there's no capacity to experiment in terms of the financial investment. The cities are living on razor-thin margins, but there's also politically no social capital to experiment because failure defeats you right at in the next electoral cycle. So when a good little idea emerges, and we've had, I hope I championed a number of them, you're dealing with such ass covering. So it's like you're governed by a league of insurance agents and lawyers that are always doing risk assessment in a political environment, which is nothing but risk assessment. And so, in order I'm not sure there's as much money in the development industry as they like to. We all think there is, but you can't build a city leveraged off condominium units at 600 square foot a pop. It just isn't the profit margin there. What we need is a tax structure for cities that allows them to collaborate with developers so that when there is economic vitality in a neighborhood, it's matched with public vitality. And those little experiments can start. We had a great project. We championed a campaign in the downtown part of the city I represented to create non-profit commercial space, 500 square foot storefronts, sliced out of condominium projects, and then added to public amenities with converted containers. And it was amazing to see what sprung from just saying the word yes and figuring it out later. The developers would look at it and say, I can't rent a 500 square foot storefront. So I'm not asking you to. Give it to the Arts Council. They'll grant it to an artist. And a jewelry maker or a furniture maker will pop up for a day or two and move on. Spacing Magazine took one of the spots over Christmas and produced a whole product line that's now allowed them to move into a neighboring store and run a store full time while they start to publish. It starts by creating a space for that experimentation. We have a community center in a very low-income neighborhood where kids have been trained 3, 4, and 5 times in their lifetime to write a resume and never have a job to apply for. We created, a community leader came to us and said, I have an idea to take containers I've seen in Brooklyn and Paris and stuff and turn them into non-profit storefronts for the local community. Families started little businesses, amazing little businesses. One kid went on an exchange program to Ghana, came back with shea butter, and sold enough shea butter in about a week to finance his school dues for the rest of the year. And these little experiments, not only did they provide and generate wealth in low-income neighborhoods, they took a really windswept, sort of brutal piece of streetscape in Toronto and animated it into a market. The investment, next to nothing. The cost of failure, next to nothing, but the opportunity that was realized, I don't think you could put a price on it.
But what you're saying is that there's space for a certain level of optimism. And we saw that yesterday with the mayors. There was a level of energy and a desire for those people
Building
to change
cities
the
it's
shape
fun
of
to build a
cities,
city.
which is, there seems to be a strength there if it's wisely used. I have another question because the weather. We know it's the right day to talk about that. It's Norman talked about cold cities, but does the kind of climate we have makes Canada different from other countries when we think in terms of infrastructure and urban development? Are we different? Are we unique? Do we have problems that other cities don't have? You can start.
We certainly are different. We do have many challenges which are weather and climate related that most other countries don't have. And unfortunately, we haven't dealt with them very well. I think we need a whole series of building regulations that take into account some of these little kinds of things about which I spoke. Very simple. I mean, sun, wind, snow drifting, and so on and so forth. We have some of the best microclimate engineers, actually, in the world in Canada, who can simulate all these things, snow drifts, wind speeds, and who can mitigate these kinds of effects, negative effects. But interestingly, most of their work is outside of Canada. They do some work Up north in the subarctic, they work for airport authorities and so on and so forth. They work for highway departments to minimize snow drifting on roads by building snow fences. But they don't generally do too much work in cities when there are very big projects. Yesterday in De La Presse, I saw a project for, I think, a 65-story tower somewhere on the Grande Allée in Quebec City. Whether or not microclimate engineers are brought in and to do some simulations on wind and snow drifting and climate comfort at the pedestrian, at the street level, I have no idea, but if I had to take a guess, the answer would be they probably didn't. Because these things cost a bit of money, but they're not very expensive relative to the whole cost of such a large-scale development. So I think that we have to look for some inspiration in the Scandinavian countries, which I was hinting at, but we generally haven't really done that. They're much better adapted since the 1920s and the 1930s. They have lots of regulations that, for example, balconies have to be south-facing, or an apartment has to have some south-facing windows. So an apartment building isn't designed the way it is here with a double-loaded corridor. And half of the apartments are on one side. They might be on the south side, but then the other half are on the north side. They get no sun whatsoever. They have to have a different plan, a different organization of space, so that the apartments have a double exposure. They go right through the entire building. So they have south and north exposure, or maybe east and west exposure. So we have to rethink, and that doesn't add any extra cost to anything.
Anybody else? I mean, I think in terms of winter climate, there's two levels. I agree with Norman. You know, we're developing the whole neighborhood, so we did wind studies and sun studies in preparation of where the streets should go and where the main street should go and where pools should go and where to place the towers. But we didn't work with a microclimate engineer, and you know, if a city had mandated us to do so, we probably would have adjusted, you know, differently. But I certainly think that the technology is there to plan public spaces. To Norman's last point, I think that Montreal, from my experience, Montreal is an amazing climate for energy efficient buildings. We are latitudinally perfectly positioned for geothermal energy. So the payoff on geothermal, which is free energy, is relatively quick to other places in the world. Our buildings have heat exchangers, as Norman was saying. The south side, which is takes cooling in the summer, the excess heat, instead of being pumped outside, is treated and pumped into the units, the condos, on the north side of the building, so that the 3/4 of the year, the building is zero energy consuming because of the shared energy between that. That's something we did on our own in order to be a LEED building, but I believe that the governments should require a certain minimum of energy efficiency in our building practices, but that's not the case yet.
One of the ways that can be achieved is a new national building standard, which is not prescriptive to provinces or interfere with local jurisdiction, but it's one which you can measure your local jurisdiction's performance against and say, hey, look at, you know, the best way to do district energy is X, Y, and Z. Why isn't that a requirement of the cities? And I'll give you a great example. Schoolyards, playing fields. Canada has created a public school system, a great system, with some of the most generous school environments for geothermal. If you were to require schools to create district energy plants under their playing fields and hook it into their boiler rooms in the older parts, but into their basements in the newer parts of the world, you could actually help finance education by having communities buy energy from schools, finance schools, and take schools off the grid while you took individual housing units off the grid. And in older parts of Canada, where the schools are most generous and where the neighborhoods are most compact and where the buildings quite often have radiators, and so they're pre-engineered for district heating and cooling with a heat exchange with liquid, we're poised for victory. We tried to do this in Toronto, and the school board got into a big scandal because of the price they paid to install pencil sharpeners, and the province shut down their capital program, and we lost the pilot project. And we couldn't get funding out of provincial government because they didn't trust the capacity of a school to deliver a solution like this. British Columbia, on the other hand, took a look at it as they retrofit their schools for earthquake-proof engineering and realized that they should make every new school start and be constructed with geothermal district heating capacity so that you actually built schools that were impossible to pull out of neighborhoods. But also, the environmental payoff is so obvious. It takes a mindset change, but it also requires governments funding risk and shouldering that risk and being given some leeway through the electorate to fail. Fail fast, fail spectacularly, but to fail in the interest of making an improvement.
Merci. On va passer à la salle. Y a-t-il des commentaires, des questions? En voici une. Dans la langue que vous préférez. En fait, je parle de l'anglais et du français.
Thank you for a great panel. So, I mean, we heard this yesterday with the mayors, and we're hearing it today, that cities need to either have their own taxation base or need to have more money and so on. But the phrase was used, a New Deal for cities, as a federal thing. I mean, can we actually, would it be more daring to imagine really a big federal government project for cities, or is it really about giving more resources to cities? I mean, everyone will say cities know their problems because they're at the grassroots level, but in fact, in the 1930s in the United States, there was massive federal investment in cities and control over a lot of the projects. I mean, is that in many ways the preferable solution?
No, look at, cities are built with good ideas. Ideas do not flow from ideology. And they don't flow from a control of ideas. They flow from radically decentralizing the capacity, both economic and intellectual, to build better cities. And in a country as diverse and as challenging, and I'm learning this as I go across the country now and talking to different groups like this, that you can't politically operate Vancouver like you do Quebec City, like you do Sydney, Nova Scotia, let alone, Iqaluit. So you've got to radically decentralize, and with that radical decentralization, you need economic capacity and political autonomy delivered to regions.
I would maybe add, though, and it connects a little bit back to the question that Alain just asked, is that I agree with that point very much, but I also think there's opportunity to orchestrate the opportunities. And I think that can happen at all levels. Like, what's interesting with the Civic Assets Project is you can almost imagine it as a microcosmic study of what happens at sort of various levels of government. So a given asset, let's say, sort of exists within a borough of the city of Montreal. There's sort of a vested community around that asset that's of interest. Then there's the borough level, then there's the municipal level, then in some cases it's provincially, and in some cases it's a federal asset, like the post offices, for instance. So how do you start to sort of look at all those vested stakeholders and start to understand the opportunity that asset represents in relationship to the other things, right? So similarly, I think, to speak about what's unique about Canada or Canadian cities, I mean, I think we're sitting on such huge amounts of potential in terms of our cities. We're one of the most urbanized populations in the world. We have cities that are, we have enough cities that we can actually understand sort of the way cities behave, but we have few enough that it's actually a manageable project to understand how these different cities can become grounds for experimentation, innovation, new ideas about city building and such. We have radically different economic profiles of the cities. We have sort of incredibly, Toronto's the fastest growing city in North America right now. Montreal is what I like to call the sort of slow grow city, which actually is very interesting on its own terms. We talk a lot about shrinking cities, we talk about booming cities, but very rarely do we talk about what slow growth actually might allow. So given the sort of different proliferations of sort of city models, I think that at a federal level, what we should be looking at are the ways in which all of those cities represent new opportunities for rethinking opportunity, strategy, and potential if well orchestrated. So I think it depends on sort of coordination of all levels, but ultimately I think there is a role for the federal, for the feds to play.
I agree on those terms. So I wouldn't be there if I didn't.
I'd like to talk about money, but more about the evaluation. I'm wondering if the Civic Assets Project or the Nuns Island Project, there's obviously economic value. I'm talking fiscally for the cities, even in terms of taxes on the long term, of maintaining green space or, like making sure that the neighborhoods are interesting for people to go there, it creates value. It's sort of like, and is that measure available? Have you done that measure? I'm looking at, we have a project in Plateau Mont-Royal for maintaining artist space. We managed to do a deal because the mayor was audacious or, obnoxious, whatever. But he was great because he actually was, he didn't use any money. He just used regulatory mechanisms to maintain spaces for artists at a low cost because it brings value, economic value to the real estate owners of the commercial space, but also to the city, because in the long term, the tax return for the cities is going to be greater if we maintain what has value, whether it's social, environmental. So I'm wondering, are there mechanisms that you have studied that allow us to give us a ratio of, okay, if we maintain this civic asset, what is it going to do fiscally for the next 20 years?
Sure. No, it's a great question. I mean, it's to the heart, and in a way it's the way by which to get certainly public political support for projects, right? There have been studies, we're looking, what's interesting for us is that in a way we've taken on the kind of incredible task of defining what a civic asset is, let alone what civic function is, right? So, kind of can you make the argument that, for instance, Metropolitan News Agent, what does it mean to have a newsstand, right? And how do you impact and measure the importance of a newsstand in a neighborhood like your downtown core of a city? So, we have a kind of vast array, and so what we're working on, just to answer, so there are a number of studies for sure that look at sort of, the tax-based impact of various types of projects, including artist space and such. We can talk about that if you want some references later, but one of the things we're looking at actually is to look a little bit more broadly to understand what civic health is. So how do you actually, and to create what we're calling sort of a civic index, which is actually kind of, the idea of actually compounding, right, and sort of understanding of different types of use and health and social viability, so that it's not just also looking at the kind of financial impact, but also sort of social impact across various registers. So it's a complex equation that will iterate certainly for months, if not years to come, but certainly the metrics are a huge dimension of the project.
You don't need a study. Check a real estate listing. You know what drives value in real estate? Location, location, location. Unpack what location is, and you'll see close to schools, near transit, great park, and wonderful library around the corner with a hospital. Every one of those is a civic investment. And so when we put the land transfer tax in Toronto, which I recommend for all cities, by the way, when we put a sales tax on property, we knew that the money we were going to get back from that, we could reinvest into property and build property value. So the market provides that answer. It's not rocket science. All cities need is the financial capacity to succeed, and they will.
Alan? Sure. I agree with both those points. I think, I'm coming from the perspective of a private developer, and so this may sound counterintuitive, but certainly there are studies that show that walkable to commercial and great parks in your neighborhood and civic assets bring up the value of real estate. And I think the danger in going purely the economic route is how do you deal, as Adam was saying, with racial poverty. And so when a developer doesn't have an interest in coming in, it really turns to the city to say, this is a long-term investment. Not only, ultimately it will have a positive impact in the bottom line of the real estate values and of valuations, but I think we have to start looking at social value and the quality of communities in order, as Adam was saying, to bring up the livability and sociability of neighborhoods. And so I think, we don't need studies, it's there.
It's I'm not a urban planner, I'm not an architect, I'm an economist, and it's also obvious for an economist that cheap development and short-term view are bad business. So I think that whatever your starting point, you'll get to the same answer. We're at the time where I would ask for short questions and short answers.
Okay, thank you so much for the conversation. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Justine McIntyre, City Councillor in Montreal. I asked a question yesterday. This will be my last question today, I promise. I'm really enjoying this conversation about how to develop in an intelligent way and what makes sense, developing where there's infrastructure already in place, where there are public spaces already in place. I'm in a borough where right now my mayor, and I wish he was here to hear this conversation, is contemplating a development in the far west end of the borough where there is no infrastructure at all. It's currently a protected green space, and he wants to put in 5,000 houses. So I think that we're heading for a mistake, and so I would like to know, first of all, as perhaps Adam could answer this question as a city councillor, there's something I think that's not being said, which is that we do feel that our hands are tied to a certain extent by the developers and by the prospect of bringing in more tax dollars. That's one thing. The other elephant in the room is that it was mentioned by Ilan that cities should be more proactive in talking about and going after the kinds of developments that the cities that we need, in fact. And this is almost impossible to do right now in a post-Charbonneau Commission environment for politicians to sit down with developers. They really put the fear of the Lord in us after our election about receiving any kind of lobbying or having those kinds of conversations. So how do we as cities then go out and create the cities that we need without generating conflict of interest or losing economic opportunities? Big question, I know.
Well, I think this is a quick answer. You've got to become proactive. Don't wait for the developer to arrive with financial interest on the project to negotiate. Do the community planning before the developer arrives. First of all, you get much more of an imaginative response from the public. Secondly, you won't have to worry about sitting down with moneyed interests. You'll be sitting down with architects and planners and urban visionaries and get out in front. I come from a part of Toronto where there is no new land to build on, so I probably got, when I was a councillor, had more 50-story buildings under construction than anywhere else in the country in one square block. We had a collaborative, proactive process that the developers liked as much as the residents liked, as much as I liked. The people that hated it were the bureaucrats because they had nothing to do. We designed the neighborhood and then said, go ahead and build. And that's the way to do it.
Just one sentence. It's hard today in Montreal in that climate, and I can say I don't think we could have started the project today in this climate. We wouldn't have been able to do today the envisioning that it took 10 years ago to get this project off the ground.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll make this pithy. I'm Andrew Miller. I work with the City of Mississauga. I have a mandate from them to take Dundas Street in Mississauga, which is very wide, full of big box retail, and it's on our major road arterial, turn it into a street with mass transit and a dense urban space. So for you guys, what infrastructure should I be looking for to incorporate into that plan? What are the necessary elements to take wide suburban big box arterial into an urban mass transit successful urban space?
Good luck. I didn't have a driver's license until I was 46, so I'm not necessarily the best person to answer this question. And I grew up and live in a downtown environment. Whenever you encounter, what you're trying to do is build like an old city, and so there's lots of history around to do it. But I was at a conference for walkability in Amsterdam, and there was a Portuguese guy whose name I wish I could remember, who said that what you need to do is actually house poverty in your community. They will create a walkable environment because they have no choice but to do that. And then you'll watch gentrification happen and you'll think you're being a genius. And there is a certain reality. It's more often described as bring a bunch of artists in, who are usually poor, let them generate that great walkable, creative, imaginative neighborhood, and then watch the magic happen. And so my advice to you would be to start a really strong arts program, to turn over the parking lots to pop-up entrepreneurs and just build the transit as quickly as possible and green as much as you can, and then revisit it very quickly.
Thank you, Madame.
This is a quick question. I don't know if it's a quick answerable quickly, but some of you have spoken about democratization of the benefits of better infrastructure, and Ilan in particular talking about building with the idea of democratizing views to the city and these kinds of intangibles that make quality of life better for everyone. But some of the infrastructure projects or ideas that you're talking about can kind of go either way. They could benefit a few people, or they could be done in a way that would benefit everybody or a much broader base of people. And I wonder if anybody could speak to maybe some pitfalls or dangers of doing infrastructure projects or innovative infrastructure that wouldn't necessarily benefit everyone in a just way.
Answer by yes or no.
I don't know if this quite answers the question, but I think, one thing I think we need to challenge is some of the prejudices. Like, I think we heard also from the council, that sort of development is bad, developers are bad, and the sort of city is good, or people are good, or ground up is good, and top down is bad. And, I think we have to get a lot more nuanced about our understanding of what and how these things can perform, and the partners involved and the interests involved. Similarly, I think that looking really ecosystemically at projects, right? So that, I think too much we impose sort of demands on a given project that it must perform on all levels. So like any given thing has to sort of answer to the collective. It has to sort of answer to all the various stakeholders and interests on the table. When I think, in fact, it's about being strategic, right? And then that's the key. I mean, certainly with our project, that's the key, is that it's not just about any given asset sort of needs to be civic functional. It's actually, there's very strategic civic functions that are appropriate to that asset, and it's about determining that through sort of a process that can involve the stakeholders in a very important way, but through which you can actually ascertain and limit the functionality so that it's appropriate. And I think sometimes we're too ambitious, expecting things to do everything, and understanding that where and how we can actually start to apply those imperatives or interests.
OK, merci. Les deux derniers, je vais vous demander de vous poser vos questions, puis ensuite des réponses rapides qui vont servir de conclusion à nos présentateurs. Merci.
I think we'd be at a miss if we didn't talk and focus on affordable housing. There's been some teases. Yesterday, Mayor Savage talked about affordable housing. He mentioned the words 3 or 4 times. And Tanya earlier talked about social economy and community trust. I'm not sure exactly what you had behind that idea. And we have one of the important people in the opposition that also has that as a mandate. Since the Second World War, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has been the major catalyst in terms of building social and affordable housing in this country. And over the last 25 years, more and more of that responsibility has been stripped out of that organization. So my question to the panel is affordable housing. How do you see it in infrastructure? How do you see it as a country? How do you see it at the 3 levels of the government in terms of their role, and where do we go in the future with it?
Thank you. Et Madame?
Bonjour. En fait, je suis la fondatrice de la coopérative de solidarité en fabrication artistique, industrielle et technologique. Et présentement, on est en train de s'installer dans le quartier de l'innovation pour répondre à la clientèle académique, artistique et aussi industrielle, entrepreneur. Et j'aurais voulu avoir des conseils au niveau de faire en sorte que le lancement de cette coopérative-là soit un succès.
Je pense pas. Did you understand I don't think that you can help. And do you have an answer? Concluding remarks would be good.
Well, I'll address the first question. The reason when I talk about infrastructure, I lead with housing is because if you don't build housing properly, your infrastructure is a waste of time. And so in Mississauga, in the project we saw presented to us, the question you have to ask yourself is, can the dishwasher in that restaurant live in that neighborhood? And if they can't, have you just created more sprawl? And so the economic diversity of our communities is fundamental to the health of our cities. Sustaining the economic diversity requires infrastructure that is led with how we shelter people and how we move people effectively and affordably. And that's why when I talk about infrastructure, I talk about affordable housing. In fact, we have a forum with much more detail on this tonight. I would have told you where it was, but my BlackBerry is playing games with me. But there's a series of housing forums I'm holding with stakeholders, and I'm listening to stakeholders from Montreal in particular about this. We have got to do this, otherwise it will fail as a city. So affordable housing is fundamental to the success of any one of these projects you heard here today.
Merci beaucoup. On va arrêter là-dessus. Nous sommes déjà un peu en retard. Ça raccourcit un petit peu la pause que vous méritez. Et je vous remercie tous d'avoir écouté avec autant d'attention et je remercie nos conférenciers.